Welcome back to another edition of Voir Dire, the podcast that speaks the truth, just like the name itself. And today we are back and we are going to be discussing again the terrible, tragic, and horrific case of Shanann Watts, allegedly killed by her husband, Christopher Watts, up in Frederick, Colorado, also known as Weld County. And so what the first thing I'd like to do for people who have not listened in before or seen us on YouTube, I'd like to give a brief background of this particular case. All right? So the Watts family is married. They've been married roughly 6 years. They have two young children, a 4-year-old and a 3-year-old, Bella and Celeste, respectively. And the wife, Shanann, is pregnant, about 15 weeks pregnant with a new child. And if anyone's gone online, you can actually see her Facebook posts, live postings that she has put up because she was quite active on social media, because she was in selling some multi-level marketing vitamins and meal supplements and things like that. So she was constantly on social media, so you get to see kind of her interacting with her children and things of that nature. So really where this case begins is on Monday, August 13th, early morning hours. Shanann is dropped off at her home by a friend/coworker as they return back in the early morning hours from a trip to Arizona. And we get this information directly from the warrantless arrest affidavit filed by the Frederick Police Department that was signed by a judge, which ultimately arrested Mr. Watts. And so it's learned that after she is dropped off at the home at 1:48 a.m. thereabouts, and this is kind of confirmed through some security cameras. We later learn that Mr. Watts then tells the police that when she arrived, he awoke, and that he and his wife had an emotional discussion regarding his desire to separate. And they apparently go back and forth between the various rooms, and they have conversations that, although are emotional, apparently are not violent at all. And so the key moment is really between 1:48 a.m. on Monday, August 13th, and then about 5:27 a.m., a neighbor's surveillance camera captures Mr. Watts backing his truck up to his garage. And now he tells the police initially that he was loading up some tools and left for work while his children were still sleeping, and he had to go take care of some things and he would be back later. And ultimately, we find out that that's very significant, what he was loading up later when he apparently tells the police the truth or the alleged truth or a close version of it, apparently. And then about 1:40 p.m. on that same day, on August 13th, the Frederick Police Department are called to the home of the Watts family there in Frederick, because the friend who had dropped her off was concerned that she wasn't answering her phone messages and that she actually had missed a doctor's appointment that morning. And everybody knows, life is crazy, but most mothers are very excited about going to those first few doctor's appointments. And obviously, her friend must have known that Shanann wanted to be there because she was aware of it. And ultimately, the officers go to the home. They gain access with consent of Mr. Watts, and basically they find that Mrs. Watts, Shanann Watts' personal belongings are still at the house that morning. And what we know from the affidavit specifically is that when they went to the house, the officer opened the door, and they were concerned that Shanann may have been suffering or passed out due to a medical condition related to the pregnancy. It's also been learned in the last week or so that she was suffering from lupus, which is kind of an autoimmune disease, and it apparently affects your ability to kind of have energy and keep up with everything. And I'm not going to profess to be a medical doctor on that, but I think it really affects one's ability they have to really take care of their health and not get too stressed and be relaxed and things like that, so that it doesn't affect their immune system. Well, the officers arrived that morning, and they checked all the windows and doors, including the rear sliding doors, and discovered that all of them were locked, and there was no way actually into the house. And that's when the officers contacted Chris Watts and asked him for a code for the outside garage door keypad. And Mr. Watts apparently stated that it didn't work, but he would be home in only 5 minutes. And then when the officer arrived, Mr. Watts and the officer entered the home with his consent, and they attempted to locate Shanann and the two children, but discovered that they were not there. When questioned by the officer, Chris Watts stated that Shanann had arrived home roughly about 2 a.m. and that he woke up about 5 a.m. and began talking to Shanann about their marital separation, informed her that he wanted to initiate the separation. This is where Chris stated that it was a civil conversation and they were arguing, but it wasn't arguing, but they were emotional. This is where Mr. Watts then states, and is confirmed generally by some security cameras, at about 5:27, he backs up his truck to the garage to put some tools in there that he needed for work. And ultimately we learn this is about the time that he was actually loading up the bodies. And that Chris said that Shanann told him that she was going to a friend's house later that day with the two children, but didn't know the friend's name. Chris works for a petroleum company, and he just left earlier to go check on a job site. So later that day, officers request that a detective respond to the scene, and about 2:35 on that day, on the August 13th, the detective is briefed and learns that all of Shanann's personal effects, including her cell phone, purse, wallet, and medications, were located in the house. And upon entering the house, it was also obvious that her purse was on the kitchen island and the suitcase was located at the bottom of the stairs going up to the bedrooms. And her shoes were also located near the front door. Very interesting is that the detectives observed that the bed in the master bedroom had been stripped of its bedding, which was lying on the floor. And the detective and the officer checked the bedding for signs of any type of foul play, but didn't see anything that was obvious. In a loft located between the bedroom was Shanann's cell phone, and later learned that that was found in the two cushions of a sofa located in that loft area. So then the detectives, they start getting a little concerned or suspicious, and so they went and talked to Chris and once again asked him about the time period when was the last time he had seen his wife. And Chris said that she had arrived home maybe about 1:48 on the 13th, and at 4 a.m. he had informed his wife that he wanted to go through a separation, and they were both upset and crying, and that she was going to simply go to a friend's house that day. And then, once again, at about 5:30, 5:27 specifically, he loaded up his truck to go to his work site near Hudson, Colorado. And this is all, relatively confirmed by a neighbor's surveillance camera. And then we have Chris Watts then provides consent to check Shanann's phone. And ultimately, the police, collect that per his consent. And that phone is still in custody, and that phone will probably lead to a lot of information as to any type of last contact that he may have had with her before she arrived home, where she had been, any kind of text messages between her friends, her family, and even Chris Watts. So that'll be interesting to see what information that phone leads, because cell phones are literally someone's personal diaries these days, and it tracks everything that people do. So it'll be very, very interesting. So ultimately, that same day, the officers basically do a neighborhood survey to see if they could find any information as to her whereabouts. And basically nothing comes about, and then later that evening the police issue a bolo, or be on the lookout for, obviously, Shanann and her young daughters. And the police also issue a press release. The Colorado Bureau of Investigation and ultimately the FBI get into the case. And apparently on August 14th, so really kind of the following day, once again, the police, the FBI, and everybody is getting involved here, that neither Shanann nor the girls had returned home. And once again, they issued this press release. The police do their investigation and ultimately learn that Mr. Chris Watts was actively involved in an affair with a coworker, which he had previously denied. And obviously that'll be significant at any trial. Not the fact that he was having an affair. Frankly, it kind of explains why he didn't want to be in the relationship or the marriage anymore, but it also goes to his credibility, the fact that he was not being truthful with them. And so it's interesting is that the police on the 15th start, doing some investigation. They start, looking at the home. They start doing some drone searches, looking for information as it relates to where they might find the bodies. And that's where it gets interesting, is because I'm sure most people have seen the video where Mr. Watts is out front of his home and he tries to look concerned, although there's not a whole lot of emotion there whatsoever, and he is simply saying that it's the terrible night of his life. And if you listen closely to the words that he says, any prosecutor will be able to pick that apart. The lack of emotion. Your wife and your 2 children and your unborn child are missing. And I've seen more emotion from people when their newspaper doesn't arrive on time in the mornings. He just kind of is going through the motions, obviously knowing in the back of his mind that he is guilty, that he has something deep that is troubling him. So on the 15th of August, Mr. Watts is down at the police station. Apparently his father is there as well. And he apparently is coming to the position that the truth is going to be coming out, and it's going to be coming out shortly. And so Mr. Watts tells the detectives that he wants to speak to his father first, and that he would then tell them the truth. Now, I would be very interested in knowing what he told his father, because understand, there is no privilege that applies to what he told to his father. So if Mr. Watts' father was told something by Mr. Christopher Watts, then he basically is a witness. And if he confessed to him as well, that will be interesting to see what happened. So ultimately, at 11:30 p.m. on August 15th, after giving his interview, stating that he had no idea where his wife is, Mr. Watts is ultimately arrested. Now, the following day, on Thursday, August 16th, roughly about 2:30 p.m., Mr. Watts appears before the Honorable Judge Kopkow. And in that particular case, he's being advised that he is being held for investigation of homicide of his wife and 2 children, and a bond is not set. Later that afternoon, the police ultimately recover in a shallow grave the body of his wife, Shanann, and then the 2 girls' bodies are discovered later in the oil tanks near the same well site where Chris Watts stated he had left to go to work. Now, once again, this information is coming from the affidavit for arrest warrant, so we are not necessarily making this up, and the police should be telling the truth when it comes to this affidavit, because if they were not, then there would be issues about whether the information or the arrest warrant would be valid later on. And what's also interesting is that obviously Christopher Watts provides this confession to the police, and he says that specifically, per the affidavit here, Chris Watts stated that after he told Shanann he wanted a separation, he walked downstairs for a moment and then returned to his bedroom to speak with her. While in the bedroom, via baby monitor located on Shanann's nightstand, he observed Bella sprawled out on her bed and blue, and Shanann actively strangling Celeste. Chris said he went into a rage and ultimately strangled Shanann to death. Chris said he loaded all three bodies onto the back seat of his work truck and took them to an oil work site identified as the well site, and they described various GPS locations. And that's ultimately where the children were found, and his wife was found. So, like we talked about this in the previous podcast, Mr. Watts has some problems. He obviously has admitted that he strangled his wife, and then the question becomes, is it sort of a heat of passion type of thing, and that he didn't kill the two other children? That will be the ultimate question for the jury to decide in this particular case as to who killed the children. As it relates to Shanann, the question then becomes, is it first-degree murder as it's charged in count 1 of the complaint and information, or is it some sort of a lesser-included offense, a heat of passion type of situation where he would be basically given the opportunity to get out of prison one day? Because if he's convicted of 1 count of first-degree murder, it is life without parole, and if he's convicted of the murders of his 2 children, that would be 3 consecutive life sentences without parole, and he would never get out. And as we talked about last time, is this the case that warrants the death penalty? That will ultimately be determined by the district attorney in this particular case, but that decision does not need to be made for some time. When Mr. Watts appeared in court on August 21st, at that point, he would be entitled to a preliminary hearing within 35 days. But his attorneys, rightfully so, because they have a lot of work to do, they have a lot of information to collect, a lot of investigation to do, both scientifically and factually here in this particular case, they waived that right to that hearing within 35 days. They didn't waive the hearing, they waived the hearing within 35 days, and that is it. And it's set for a status conference in November. But since then, there's been a few developments. First of all, Mr. Watts has been subjected to what they call a 41-1 motion, and that is where the government can ask the court to provide DNA samples, fingerprint analysis, things that you are necessarily there's not really an expectation of privacy. And unfortunately, Colorado law basically says if the district attorney asks for it, you can do it. I've had cases where people's handwriting exemplars have been given, DNA swabs have been given, fingerprints. All that information simply requires a very quick court order, and you can't really object. Well, you can object for the record, but you're not going to get a whole lot of play on that. So that's going to be kind of the next issue to be brought up before the court, is whether the district attorney will get that. And I am very, very confident that the district attorney will get all that information, simply for the fact because it's very well settled here in Colorado that there is no expectation of privacy as it relates to the fingerprints, the swabs, and they're getting it for a legitimate purpose. Now, the other item that came up just this last Friday was that Shanann's father has filed a probate estate for his daughter's estate. And this is very normal. Anytime there's kind of whether it be a wrongful death from a car accident, deceased, you set up an estate to basically bring in all the bills, see what's there, see if anything remains. It's unclear to me, but it appears from what I have read that the house is probably in Christopher Watts' name, but it sounds like he's in debt, and that will probably be foreclosed upon and what have you. It really won't be an issue. And I really don't believe that this estate is set up for anything other than basically collecting all the bills, letting them know that she's deceased, and they can file a claim if creditors choose to do so. But then the big issue and the headlines that have been kind of going around is whether Christopher Watts will be able to recover his wife's estate from her estate because he has allegedly killed her. And I can assure you, ladies and gentlemen, that is not going to happen. This estate is going to be open for a while. As I stated, it's simply really a formality of closing out bills and things of that nature and seeing who owes what. There's probably little to any estate to distribute, and I assure you that Mr. Christopher Watts, based upon what he has stated thus far, is going to get nothing. He's been apparently served with a copy of the petition regarding the probate estate in jail, and he can respond and say he wants to be an interested party. My guess is, whether it's on advice of counsel or whether he chooses on his own, that he will simply not do that because anything he says at this point can be used against you. But specifically here in Colorado, there's a statute, Colorado Revised Statute 1511-803. Effect of homicide on intestate succession, wills, trusts, joint assets, life insurance, and beneficiary designations. And basically, it defines a felonious killing, and it says under that statute, paragraph 1B, felonious killing, except as provided in some subsection 7 of this section, is the killing of the decedent by an individual who, as a result thereof, is convicted of, pleads guilty to, or enters a plea of nolo contendere to the crime of murder in the first or second degree or manslaughter, as said crimes as defined in 18.3-102 through 18.3-104. And basically it says forfeiture of statutory benefits. An individual who feloniously kills the decedent forfeits all benefits with respect to the decedent's estate, including an intestate share, an elective share, or omitted spouse's or child's share, the decedent's homestead exemption under 3841-204, exempt property and family allowance. If the decedent died intestate, the decedent's intestate estate passes as if the killer disclaimed his or her intestate share. What does that mean in plain language, ladies and gentlemen? Mr. Watts will get nothing of his wife's estate if there is anything to distribute. This will go directly to her parents. So that is the latest update on the Christopher Watts case. We have the preliminary hearing status conference coming up in November, but we will continue to follow this case simply because it is fascinating. For an individual, a family who tried to put on that persona of everything's great, everything's fine, well, apparently everything was not happy at all. We had extramarital affairs. We had a wife who's sick, doing her best raising 2 children, who's pregnant yet again, working full-time, has a kind of a side hustle going on with her nutritional supplement program, trying to do what she can to benefit the family, and this simply was not enough. And if you look at some of those videos out there on their websites, I don't see a whole lot of love and affection going on in any of those videos. I see somebody that, from Mr. Watts' perspective, he looks like he is dead on the inside and simply just going along with the program at that time. So this will be interesting to watch. It'll be interesting to see what the district attorney will do here in the next few weeks. as far as releasing of the autopsy. Everybody apparently in the case wants to keep it not released to the public, but I think that it will ultimately come out. I do not see how it's going to affect the case. I think it'll be very difficult to possibly conduct that trial in Weld County, just given the amount of press coverage that it has received. But there are still people in the state of Colorado who have heard nothing about this case, I assure you, because I was at dinner the other night and people had never heard of it. So to find a fair jury at this point is still possible. Whether it'll be in in Weld County or somewhere else will be to be determined if it ultimately goes. But I do see this case going to trial. And we will keep you updated. Obviously, continue to listen to Voir Dire. Please download the podcast. You can also follow us on YouTube at scottreisch.com and scottreisch.com as well.